So remember last time I talked about seals, trumpet, and bowl judgment, and how you should see how those. Yes, yeah. So uh, trumpet, seal, trumpets, bowls, judgment. How this is explained in the book of Revelation. I explained that last time, right? So there are three judgments, or three names are given for the tribulation judgments. First group of judgments are known as seal judgment. There are seven. Seventh seal opens up for the next group of judgment known as trumpet judgments. And there are seven trumpet judgments. Seventh trumpet opens up the last leg of tribulation or judgment, known as bowl judgment. Right? So there are seven, Bible calls it as the last judgment. So today we are going to look at another issue that is throughout the Bible. You see the term day of the Lord. What does that mean, day of the Lord? How should we understand? So in any case, virtually all recognize the term day as used in this expression refers to a period of time, not a single day. Right? Day of the Lord, day represents not symbol here. When anytime Bible use the word day of Yahweh, day of the Lord, it doesn't talk about one single day, 24 hours. Rather, it is a period of time. We already discussed this idea in our biblical creationism. So now we are going to have an extensive look on this topic. So what are the questions that we are going to address in our class today? The character of the day of the Lord. What is that? Second, does it refer exclusively to divine judgment, or it talks about divine blessing as well? Day of the Lord, does it only talk about judgment, or does it include blessing as well? Next, how many such days are there? Right? How many such days are there? Is the day of the Lord solely eschatological? Or do the biblical authors use the term to describe historical events as well? Maybe historical events that happened in the past. Was that also day of the Lord? Third will be, when does the eschatological day of the Lord begin? Maybe that is the most important question to be asked. When does this day of the Lord begin? Does it all include all of the tribulation judgments, or only those toward the end of that period? So these are the questions that we are going to address in this discussion. Let's look at character of the day of the Lord. As to the first question, the evidence argues the day of the Lord involves both judgment and blessing. Right? Judgment and blessing. So if you look at the Bible verses, it talks about both. With Obadiah, if you read chapter 1, speaks of divine judgment, and in chapter 1, verse 17, and then verse 19 to 21 promise divine blessing, all within the context of the day of the Lord. Same thing in Joel chapter 2, right? Day of the Lord has got judgment in chapter 2, verse 1 to 11, and 3, verse 1 to 17, in verse 18 to 32, 3 to 18, 21, predict divine blessings. So, yes, Bible is abundantly clear that the day of the Lord includes both judgment and blessing. The next one. One objection that is raised against this interpretation is that expression day of the Lord is never used in sections of involving divine blessing. While such is the case, conclusion should not be drawn from this that the blessing sections must be excluded from the day of the Lord. Majority of the instances in the sections promise divine blessing. Phrases are not found such as on that day or at that time, alike, which can only have their and isn't to the previous reference to the day of the Lord. So I don't think the argument is much there. It doesn't include blessing. No. In the context, it argues for judgment as well as blessing. So that is what my first take. And I have given more references for you to look into that. All right. So the question is this: does the day of the Lord includes blessing as well? Yes, judgment as well as blessing. Now, second question is, how many such days are there? How many of them? Second question, how many days such days are there? It's much more difficult to answer. Roughly two positions are found. Number one, there are those who argue more than one day of the Lord. Yeah. Some believe there are more than one day. There are more than that. These argue that the day of the Lord is used to describe the Assyrian invasion and captivity of the northern kingdom, right? You know that. In 722 BC, Assyrians came and invaded Israel, the northern part of the kingdom. 586 BC, Babylonian invaded southern kingdom, that is Judah, right? And so there also you see the word a day of the Lord. And then the tribulation, judgments, and the destruction of the present creation preceding eternal state also said to be the day of the Lord. So maybe, yes, some people say the Assyrian invasion was on the day of the Lord. So that is a day of the Lord. Babylonian invasion was also on the day of the Lord. That is another day of the Lord. And tribulation judgment is another day of the Lord. End of the millennial kingdom is another day of the Lord. So some people say there are more than one day of the Lord. But others argue that there is only a single day of the Lord that is exclusively eschatological. That is something that is going to take place in the future. And according to them, that the day of the Lord begins with the tribulation. And it continues through the millennium and concludes the destruction of the present earth, present creation, just prior to eternal state. So proponents, those who believe that there's only a single day of the Lord, argue that the passages used to prove other historical day of the Lord even are better translated as having in view the eschatological day of the Lord. So, friends, it's a difficult question to answer, right? How many days of the Lord? Were there some historical time? Does Bible refer to those incidents at the day of the Lord? Or always day of the Lord is something future? So I say here, it is very difficult deciding between these two positions. It is true that the expression is used in context where surrounding verses are addressing a nearer judgment and a whole occasion which would support more than a single eschatological day of the Lord. However, this could be explained in one of two ways that would still allow the day of the Lord to be eschatological exclusively. The prophet could be telescoping events which on the surface appear to be related, but which with later revelation shown to be distinct. Something we learned, kind of telescopical fulfillment. Sometimes prophets use events combined in his prophecy. But when later revelation came, we know that this is separate. For example, the easy example would be Daniel chapter 9. For Daniel, 70 weeks are determined for Israel. 69th week, anointed one will be cut off. And the 70th week, the tribulation period, just begins right there. That means tribulation period should begin by the death of Messiah. But we know that now there is a huge gap now that church is filling that gap. Tribulation period begins only after the church is taken out. So yes, that's what telescopical fulfillment we looked at. So it could be something like that these prophets, when they explain one historical events, they also prophesy the end of the world along with the historical events. And they don't separate this huge gap of the church because they only look at every incident in relationship with Israel. And therefore, Messiah will come, kingdom will begin, right? That is what they prophesy. And therefore, they always use Messiah comes, kingdom begins. It's not, the rejection of the Messiah is very rarely explained in the Old Testament. Maybe Daniel chapter 9, yes, it is an example. It talks about rejection of the anointed one, Isaiah 53 and few other places, right? So generally, prophets were looking at coming of the Messiah and the establishment of the Davidic kingdom together. And therefore, oftentimes, what do? They employ those historical judgments and the end time judgment together. And therefore, sometimes they use the day of the Lord. So I am saying still, yes, we can learn and look at that day of the Lord is still something in the future. For example, now, the closest that is found in Lamentations where similar expression, day of the Lord's anger, is employed describing the depravation and horror of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 586 BC. Yes, so that's a historical event, right? Babylonian invasion. The day of the Lord's anger, that's what the Bible says. But what makes this construction significant for this discussion is that it is used in Zephaniah, same thing, to refer to the day of the Lord. However, same expression later when Zephaniah said, he used where no reference to the day of the Lord seen. Thus, expression itself is not a technical term employed by the prophet. Some later prophets also tried to differentiate, right? So friends, it's a little technical, I know. If you really wanted to say what is day of the Lord, is it are there different days? My take is that yes, I think there is only one day of the Lord, right? There's only one day of the Lord. But what happened in the Old Testament prophetical books is that the authors of prophetical books, that is prophets, they often do what? The judgment of Israel, the historical judgment that happened, always they connected with the futuristic hope. They always connected together. They would say, yes, Babylon is going to judge, or God is going to use Babylon to judge Judah. But then the blessing of the Messiah is followed. So that's why they prophesied. And so, but the blessing of the Messiah comes only now we know in the New Testament. That Messiah, when he established the kingdom, but that kingdom is still in the future. Right now, it is a church age. So that is the toughest thing in interpreting day of the Lord. So today our question is going to be not the history. Even if you are someone who believes that day of the Lord, there are different days, I think I'm okay with that. So my question is this: when does the future day of the Lord begin? Not talking about in the past, but the eschatological day of the Lord. So that will clarify some of the issues with how many days of the Lords are there. There could be some, God, the prophets would say, Assyrian invasion took place, or it was the day of the Lord. Babylonian invasion was the day of the Lord. Yes, so agreed that. Let's ask the question, the future day of the Lord, when does it begin? And this is also challenging. While there are a number of answers that have been suggested, this can be conveniently represented in two positions. There are those who argue that the future day of the Lord begins at some point in the last half of the tribulation period. Some people believe that it is in the middle of the tribulation. Remember? Yes, if you are, I don't know, maybe, let me see if I can throw something here. Yes. This is what we know, right? There will be 7 years of tribulation period. Seven years of tribulation period. And tribulation period is divided into two. You have three and a half and 3.5, right? So there are going to be 7 years of tribulation in this world. And that tribulation period is divided into two. First 3.5, second 3.5. So some people believe day of the Lord begins right here, second half. Not here. Not here. Is right here. That's what some people believe. So yes, we have you have some people argue that case. All right, sorry. All right, so the question is, how many day of the Lord is there? No, oh, sorry, not how many. Question is, when does it begin? So some people believe that it is on the second half of the tribulation period. Others argue that the day of the Lord it just begins when the tribulation period just begins. Right here. Once again, what it is. Right here. Day of the Lord begins by the tribulation period. That is what some people believe. Now, the debate revolves primarily around 4 passages, that is Joel chapter 2, 3, and Malachi chapter 4, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So there are 4 passages that are very important to tell when the day of the Lord will begin, right? Those who support the first position argue that this passage identifies certain events in the tribulation period that function as precursors for the day of the Lord, right? That's what some people believe. So that means day of the Lord must follow these events. Some of the incidents have to take place then, the day of the Lord. All right? So, for example, you have Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. Friends, can one of you read for me Malachi 4:5? Malachi 4:5. Anyone? Malachi 4:5.
Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
Right, day of the Lord. Before the terrible day of the Lord, Elijah, I'm going to send Elijah, right? So Malachi 4:5 the coming of the, okay, one second, coming of Messiah, or Messiah's forerunner at the outset of the tribulation precedes the day of the Lord. So it is before the day of the Lord begins, forerunner has to come. In Joel 2 and 2 Thessalonians 2, it is events at the midpoint of the tribulation that serves as a precursor for the day of the Lord. Joel 2:31 depicts celestial phenomena at the midpoint of tribulation that precede the day of the Lord. And 2 Thessalonians, we read, refers to Antichrist breaking his covenant with Israel at the midpoint of the tribulation. So, with preceding the day of the Lord. Finally, Joel 3:14, armies gathering for Armageddon at the end of the tribulation that's set to precede the day of the Lord. So what do you read, friends? In the Bible, you see certain events will precede. That means before the day of the Lord comes, certain events should take place. So that means, like, for example, Antichrist has to come and break the covenant that is in between, that is in the middle of the tribulation period, or celestial phenomenon, sun is darkened or moon is darkened, that kind of phenomena has to take place. So before the day of the Lord comes, so they say day of the Lord is later. It's not with the tribulation. But those who support the second position argue to the contrary. That is, these generally equate judgment aspect of the day of the Lord with the tribulation period itself. According to the Lord's description, tribulation period is divided between first half, which is called as the beginning of the birth pangs, and the second half called as great tribulation. These are all part of the day of the Lord. Applying this distinction to the day of the Lord judgment, this judgment can likewise be divided into two halves. We know the first half refer to the symbol expression day of the Lord, and second half, great and terrible day of the Lord. So yes, it depends upon how you look at those verses. Day of the Lord, terrible day of the Lord, great day of the Lord. Yeah, we can divide this way. Assuming this is the case, Joel chapter 2:31 and Malachi chapter 4 verse 5 are both describing events that are to take place before the great terrible day of the Lord. That's how we divide it. So yes, the conclusion is this, friends. Yes, day of the Lord begins by tribulation period. But there are other times Bible says terrible day of the Lord. Maybe we may have to say that is a reference to the second half of the tribulation, because as I said here, if you look at the tribulation period, right? I said tribulation period, and you have tribulation period here, the first half, we can say this is day of the Lord. Right, day of the Lord, or DOL. Let's say day of the Lord. What about this one? Bible just use that word now. Right now we read terrible, right? Terrible day, or DOL, terrible day of the Lord. So yes, Bible distinguishes them to tell the severity of these events. So, but generally we can say it's all part of the day of the Lord, but there are some time Bible says it is a terrible time, terrible day of the Lord. That's why we need to see this day of the Lord in the Bible. So yes, Bible does talk about day of the Lord, and it begins with the tribulation period. Tribulation period. All right. Now, what else we need to look at in here? Yes, that's phrase. Lastly, two events in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3 that trigger day of the Lord. What are they? If you look at, one is known as people who fall away from faith, apostasy. And second is revelation of the man of lawlessness. Let's read that verse, 2 Thessalonians now.
Let no one deceive you by any means, for the day will not come unless the falling away comes first. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition.
Oh, yeah. Right? It says that day will not come until the first has to, unless the apostasy comes first. And then the man of the lawlessness is revealed, the son of perdition or son of distraction. Who is that? It is Antichrist. So it says, by that, so what is, let's look at what is this apostasy? Apostasy refers to professing Christendom, falling away from the gospel immediately after the rapture of the church. So when is this apostasy? I know that some of us maybe might think, oh, even now apostasy happens, right? Yeah, some people do, but it's not wholesale. But right after the rapture of the church, this is going to happen. The remaining people who claim to be Christians, who are not raptured, who are not genuine Christians, they are going to reject the gospel to pave the way for Antichrist and to pave the way for an ecumenical church here, ecumenical church. So with the church is removed, professing Christendom quickly abandons any semblance to the gospel. Furthermore, revelation of the man of lawlessness takes place when Antichrist makes his covenant with the nation Israel. That is part of this Daniel's 70th week. Not when he breaks the covenant. When he breaks the covenant, at the midpoint. Let's look at Daniel 9. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Let's read that verse as well. Daniel 9, 27. Anyone?
Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate.
Yes, so again, this is what we read. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. This is Antichrist making covenant with Israel for a week. What is that 1 week? 1 week, there are 70 weeks. Of course, 70 weeks talks about talks about 490 years. 1 week is 7 years, right? 1 week, 7 years. So what Antichrist is going to do, he's going to make a treaty with Jewish people for 1 week, right? He's going to now, but what he's going to do in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice, and the wing of the abomination will come as one who makes desolate. And that is exactly what Jesus pointed out in Matthew 24, that this is the midpoint of the tribulation, Jesus says in Matthew 24. So he breaks the covenant at the midpoint. Thus, these events which trigger the day of the Lord, and the second event initiates Daniel's 70th week and the tribulation judgments. So, after carefully weighing the evidence, The second position which you see is the day of the Lord beginning with the start of the tribulation is preferred. I think actually the day of the Lord begins when Antichrist makes the treaty. That is the beginning of the tribulation period, when the apostasy takes place. While other passages can be interpreted in support of the second position as well, also the identification of the judgment aspect of the day of the Lord with the tribulation judgment is consistent with this description, both in scripture. So, friends, let me say how long this day of the Lord is going to have. This is to me, all right, this starts this way. Let me draw a big line. The day of the Lord begins tribulation period, right? Tribulation period. Begins at tribulation. 7 year of tribulation period. Then there will be 75 days of judgment. Then there will be 1,000 years of millennial kingdom. And then there is white throne judgment right here, white throne judgment, the end of the tribulation. And then you have eternal state, right? Eternal state. That's the way it is going to be. So, day of the Lord begins right here, when the tribulation period ends, right here, and it goes all the way until end of the 1,000 years, because there is judgment taking place at the end of the 1,000 years. They're all considered to be in the Bible DOL, right? Day of the Lord, beginning with tribulation, ending with millennial kingdom judgment. That is what the picture, if you read, you get about the day of the Lord. So if you think that there are other places, like it's not one time, but there are other, like a historical day of the Lord, I'm okay with that. There's nothing, I don't think it is a big thing, because yes, certain prophets describe Babylonian invasion as taking place in the day of the Lord. Assyrian invasion taking place in the day of the Lord? Yes. But when we talk about the eschatological day of the Lord, pretty clear, it starts from tribulation, after the rapture, goes throughout the millennial kingdom. That is what we learn. All right? All right, so any question on that? So I think we will stop here, and then from tomorrow onwards, we will go to other portions of the scripture and see how we have to look into the Revelation chapter by chapter, and gaps, judgments, how we need to look at. We will look at that tomorrow. Tomorrow we are going to look into the Bible itself clearly about how you are going to read, how you should read Revelation, how these 3 series of judgment, like seals, trumpets, and bowl judgment takes place, and what are something known as interlude. I will explain that tomorrow as we look into the Revelation. All right. Any questions?
So here I have a question. That here it talks about the apostasy. Apostasy of whom? Apostasy of Jewish or any particular people, or apostasy of the believers?
Oh, no, it's Christians. There are, what happens, genuine believers that are part of the church will be raptured. That means there will be many people who call themselves to be Christians left. That they are not genuine Christian, because with their life they have rejected, but they professed to be Christians. They are not going to be taken on, because rapture is only for the true church, for genuine Christians. And then what they do, those who are left here, they are going to reject the gospel completely. That is the apostasy that we are talking here. Professing Christian who one time claimed to believe the gospel, now they reject Jesus Christ completely, because it's not they are going to believe Jesus Christ. Oh, Jesus' promise was sure, it happened. Or we should believe what actually going to happen. That is what Paul says. They are going to reject the gospel. So apostasy is talking about professing believer who did not genuinely trust Jesus, because there was no life change. They did not genuinely trust. There was no genuine change in them. They profess to be Christians. They profess to believe in the gospel. Now the stand is, no, we don't. What we are going to the gospel is going to be removed. Let's have a worldwide peaceful religion, something known as an ecumenical Babylon. An ecumenical Babylon has to come as the tribulation period progress. That Antichrist has to rule through this ecumenical religion, so they are going to reject the gospel completely. The professing church is going to do this apostasy. Not talking about Jewish people.
Okay. So there is another. Thank you, sir. And there is another question, and you see Luke chapter 21 and Matthew chapter 24 as well. And, there are sequentially that we can see, sequences that we can see, different, eschatologically we can differentiate, maybe in a theologian can differentiate it eschatologically. And you see, there is first a false prophets comes, and when Jesus was, the disciples were asking about what is the signs of your next coming. And he was answering, first false prophets will come, and wars and rumors of war and earthquake and pestilence. Then the persecution he talks about. And then the other sequence come when Luke, the Gospel of Luke and chapter 21 and 20 onwards. And when we read, and when the armies, the Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, then the great desolation, and he talks about over there. Then after that, after I think of 4 verses, then the apocalyptical signs and catastrophical signs, and that cataclysmic signs will that it talks about. And now celestial, because the earth is going to be destroyed. So many signs could be, and and sun and moon and all these things happens there. So here, at present time, what is happening in eschatologically, and what is happening, this false prophecy and persecution, these are all, can you make it like that? We can depict like that? You understood?
No, not really. Yes, I understood. As far as false prophecy is concerned, prophets are concerned, that was a thing that God always reminded his people from the Old Testament time onwards, that there can be false prophets among you and what you should do. So the warning against false prophecy is being given from the time of Moses, especially chapter 18 of Exodus, or Deuteronomy, sorry. You see, but what is happening? So if you look into Matthew 24, of course, I'm not going to take time and explain in detail today, because we are going to deal with this topic as the next topic is eschatology, and we are going to look into every details of this one clearly, right? So what I wanted to say is that there are questions raised at the end of Matthew chapter 23, if you read, and 24, especially the beginning. All right, what is the sign of the destruction of this temple? And then second question, what is the sign of the kingdom? Before kingdom starts, what are the signs for this second coming? Like you are going to come back again to establish the kingdom. What are the, so before the kingdom starts, what are the things going to take place? So what Jesus is saying in Matthew 24, yes, he talks about first a little bit of the temple, then suddenly he enters into the sign of his coming to establish the kingdom. he divides into two, connecting that to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And he divides the first half called as the time of the birth of pang, where you have wars and rumors of war, famine, when you will call, and they say that they are Christ and things like that. And then he bring the verse from Daniel, Jesus, and say, when you see the abomination of dissolution, see, yes, it is clear now. And so then the rest, maybe Matthew 24, verses 15 onwards, Jesus starts to talk about the great tribulation. So tribulation also can be divided, as I said, maybe the first part of tribulation and the second part. Second part is usually referred to as great tribulation, where Jesus describes the rest of the 24 of Matthew. So, so as I said before, none of these events that take place today, right? I never connect them to be the signs of his coming. I think it is unwise to say or preach that way, because this is what people have done in the past, right? When there was, I remember in my childhood, there was a war between Iraq and America. It was the preacher's story, or everyone preached. Yes, it was in 1993. And they said, yes, the war started, and Antichrist is going to come, rule the world, 7 years, by 2000, the world will end, things like that. And this is every time when war happens, then people will come up, take some verses and say, these are the signs of, and I am saying, for the rapture, there are no signs at all, because the rapture is imminent. Can happen at any time. It can happen today. It can happen a week after. It can happen a month after, a year after, or 100 years after. We don't know. It can happen at any time, because Jesus has his people to be redeemed from every tribe. And once, when he knows that time, when the body of Christ is completed, the bride of Christ is completed, that is a time he's going to come to take his church. And I don't know that when, but one thing is sure, when the body is removed, bride is removed from this world, then there is 7 years of tribulation, for sure. And then he established the kingdom. That's the way I look at it, which means Bible doesn't allow me, the way that I look into the scripture doesn't allow me any war that is taking place today to connect as the signs of Jesus coming. Any earthquake, any famine that happens today as a sign of Jesus. I don't do that. And I go verse by verse, Matthew 24 or Luke 21, and Mark 13, I guess, verse by verse, and look at in the context what it says. So that's where I see it. So yeah, I am not talking, I think it is unwise. Of course, for example, apostasy. Apostasy has been, there, like even Paul's time, there was apostasy, right? But what happens when the church is removed? There is a unanimous effort from the Christendom to reject the gospel, so that Antichrist can take over. And so that is what's going to happen. So that's why I look at. Yeah.
So here again, your answer again, it raises another question, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. Here is the persecution. So, sir, are you denying the persecution that God's children that now undergoing on the past they were undergoing? By saying it's none of these things and happening, so this present age, is not depicting the what Jesus has mentioned over there.
Yeah, I don't deny any persecutions. In fact, I always talk about it. Look at the church history. Nero and other people. What did they do? They killed the people. They killed God's people who were believers. And let's go through the church history. Roman Catholics, for simply for translating the Bible, they burned people alive. See, persecution has been going on. Jesus has allowed the persecution from the beginning of the church. If you look at, this started in Jerusalem. This is what we read in the book of Acts. There arose a great persecution. And that made people to spread, go to other parts. So Jesus allows persecution from the beginning on. This is part and parcel of the church. The church will go time and again through persecution so that the evangelistic fervor will never stop. People will be more carried out with this passion when there is more persecution. And therefore it is always part of the church, no doubt. Persecution is different, tribulation is different. It is
So
a period of time where completely ruled by Antichrist. So I look at that also as different.
So you talk about the tribulation time, evangelism, that persecutions. You talk about,
Yes,
here it
there is
talks
going to
about.
be, yes, there is going to be much
So that
persecution.
mainly for the Jewish people, those who are saved, Jewish will go to the world, even the uttermost part of the world, and they'll do the evangelism and they
Yes.
preach the gospel.
Yes,
And
I
during
mean,
those,
yes.
yeah, okay.
And it is like for this, two witnesses are going to be the key to in the evangelistic efforts. And then there is one like 44,000 and other people who are also part of them, could be. And the greatest evangelistic work is going to take place during tribulation period. It is going to be huge and humongous, I say, because of the events that is taking place. Yes.
So none of these things in Matthew's Gospel 24 and Luke 21 says about
today.
what happening before the rapture, right? Before the rapture, the signs and what are the earthquake is now, and pestilence, even the corona, COVID-19, and it was not, and famine, and it is not, and okay, everything it talks about after rapture, right?
Yes. In the context of those passages, yes. That's the way I look at it. Because I believe rapture is imminent, like it can happen at any time. That's the way I look at it. And that means we don't know. And I also looking at Romans chapter 9, 10, 11. There's a passage at the time of Gentiles has to be. That is, the idea is that the church time has to be over. That is the building of the church, the time of Gentiles. For the restoration of Israel, the time of the Gentile has to be reached. What does that mean? The last person whom Jesus elected to be the part of the church has to be saved. And that means we don't know who and when, but yes, the bride of Christ has to be complete for the rapture to take place. But I don't know when and who else. So it can happen today. We don't know. That's the way I see it.
Okay, sir. Thank you. This is clear.
Sure.